later, so we really look forward to it.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to be here. We had fun last night, so we had dessert first, and now we've got the meat. And I hope it'll be interesting. Some of you, I noticed last night from the introduction, do have some background in the sciences, or engineering, or medicine, or whatever. No pure mathematicians I didn't discover. Too bad, because that's the part of the sciences I've always loved best. But with math, you can at least carry on a conversation with almost anyone else in the sciences and engineering, if you've got a little math background. So that's what I use, that's where I get it. We're not really going to do serious, deep, hard-nosed philosophy here. If we were, you'd get bored and walk out in the middle, I'm sure. I'm going to work using philosophical background and using theological background and using a working understanding of what the sciences are like, because I studied math and physics once, to help us find an attitude, a way of framing our thoughts and feelings about the relationship between science and theology. But there is a lot of hard, deep, serious stuff, books long of it, of which I've read almost 200, about science and theology issues, about the meaning of science, about the structure of science, about the philosophical underpinnings of theology, some of which are pretty good, some of which are middling, some of which are junk. But I've got that stuff in the background. But I'm not just delivering a philosophical lecture. We're looking for an attitude that will help us in our faith understand and recognize what's going on. So, let's, what do I do? Just press it open. Now, I noticed that you used my trick, so we've already prayed. There we are. This is just Long's Peak in Colorado. Whoop, got past it, didn't I? My parents live in Colorado. My name means the mountains, so this is one of the 3 pictures of mountains I got for you to look at in these presentations. I climbed that mountain. Wow. Yeah, not that face of it. Not that face of it. If you go around the backside, it's a walk-up. There's no technical stuff at all. You just walk up a steep trail. Mind you, there's a place where the trail is as wide as a sidewalk, with a cliff on this side of you going up 800 feet and a cliff on that side of you going down 2,000 feet. But it's as wide as a sidewalk. It's just exposed. All right. So maybe you've been exposed to the idea of what scientific method is. It used to be that there was this classic explanation in high school textbooks that scientific method was based upon observation and questioning and forming hypotheses to answer questions, and then doing experiments, and experiments that could be repeated in other places by other people, and then coming to conclusions and answering your questions. And it was a lovely little theory, and very nicely laid out, and actually it was too neat, it was too clean, and it wasn't a lot like what scientists actually do. Because scientists, it's like a slice out of the middle. Some people undertook to do some serious study, both historically and philosophically, about what scientists really do in terms of what their everyday activities are, in terms of how they respond when something amazing or difficult happens. And they came up with a somewhat more sophisticated understanding of the procedures of science. And you'll see in a minute why I've got Einstein in the picture. But in actual science, you don't start with observation because you're already a trained scientist. You spent 4 years at undergraduate school, you spent 4 years in graduate school, you wrote a dissertation, you did experiments. You've already got a theory. You were trained in a theory. You've been taught how to think using the theory you've got as the form of your thinking. And you start from that theory and you try to solve puzzles that the theory creates for you. Puzzles like, okay, the speed of light is the same for all observers. What is it exactly? Can I measure it better than anyone else? Or, okay, we've now got a quantum description of how electrons interact. Can I use that to figure out how atoms combine chemically? Or, gee whiz, now we've got telescopes that can see by radio waves into the far distance. Can we measure the background temperature of the universe? These are puzzles to be solved, and the theory sets them up and describes what sort of things might or might not be true, and what sort of things we're looking for and why, and defines what would count as a solution to the puzzle if we solved it. And that's most of what scientists do. They solve puzzles that either help to interpret the theory, or that extend the theory to new stuff, or that test bits and pieces of the theory that, I mean, when you make up a theory, you say, this is true about everything. All mass and energy is conserved, anywhere and everywhere throughout the universe. Well, actually, we've only tested it inside of 600 or 700 laboratories, all on this one little planet. But we assume that it's true elsewhere. One of the things we do, one of the puzzles we solve, is extending the theory, trying to find new things that we can double check that the theory does work for. Or we measure the details of the theory. We're filling in the details. But one of the things that happens when scientists do this is they bump into puzzles they can't solve. They bump into problems that are recalcitrant, problems that stand up against them and refuse to give them an answer. And so mostly scientists say, I'm just not good enough yet. I'm going to have to up my game to solve this puzzle. Or other scientists say, all right, I'm 28, I just finished my PhD, I want to get famous. Where's there a puzzle that people have been trying to solve for 30 years and no one can get it? I'm going to attack that one. They love to do that. Scientists all love to. I'm going to solve the puzzle that nobody else can solve and prove I'm really smart and change the world like Einstein did. When puzzles refuse to be solved, it creates an anomaly in the theory. Anomaly means not according to the law. Something in the world behaves in a way that the theory doesn't describe right. The theory doesn't describe right. The famous one was the one that triggered Einstein's thinking. When Michelson and Morley said, okay, light goes through space, let's figure out what difference it makes, what direction we're traveling in. And they set up an experiment to measure the speed of light in different directions according to the different kinds of travel. And no matter what they did, the speed of light always measured the same. No matter where, no matter how, no matter what they oriented it as. And that didn't make sense under all the theories they had in hand. When anomalies mount up, that's when scientists start saying, hey, what if our theory's wrong? What if our theory's not merely incomplete? What if it's wrong? What if it doesn't even understand what the world is all about? What if we made a basic mistake about what sort of things are in the world and how they behave? We better start worrying about that now. We better start thinking about that. So Einstein did one of those things you do. You start a revolution. You upset a theory completely if you have to. He said, okay, let's take this thing that doesn't make any sense and let's make that the start of our theory. First thing in my theory, the speed of light is the same for everybody everywhere all the time, no matter what. No matter how you're moving, no matter why you're moving, no matter where you are. Let's start from that. Before, that was the anomaly. Now, it's the centerpiece of our theory. Let's see if we can make sense of the world that way. And if you can set up puzzles, and one of the puzzles to solve, or rather hundreds of puzzles to solve, are, does the new theory explain the same things that the old theory did, and does it explain new stuff as well? Does it explain new stuff as well? And if that happens, then you get a break and a revolution in the practice of science. And the revolution has been described by historians of scientists as being like a religious conversion. You have to break loose from the way you were trained to think for 8 years in college and graduate school and switch to a new way of thinking in order to turn some of those anomalies into puzzles that you can solve. But if you can't, try this. Yeah, we're going to get back to this. But if I turn those anomalies into puzzles that can be solved under the new theory. But you got to cover a lot of what the old theory covered, or it won't work. And you got to cover something new besides, and for the best theories, they'll turn out to explain something that we weren't even trying to explain when we started. That's the real test as to whether a new theory is good. If it not only explains what we were trying to explain, but explains other things as well that we weren't even trying to look at. There's an attitude, an underlying attitude about what science is, about what the world is, and about what theories and thought are all about. And it's this underlying attitude in the sciences that I want us to get at, because that's the piece of what science is that we're going to work with. I'm not going to teach you any quantum electrodynamics. I can just barely recognize the math of that myself. So here's some of the underlying attitudes of science. Intersubjective testing just means, hey, if I discover something here, I can tell you about it, and you can go look for it yourself and find the same thing. Or if I perform an experiment here, you can do the experiment in your laboratory over there, and you'll find the same thing, or approximately the same thing, or nearly the same thing. Close enough. Science doesn't deal with stuff that's only true just one time in just one place. Science doesn't even deal with that stuff. That's why history can be real, but in a certain sense it's not scientific. A historical event happens at one time and in one place, and it's not repeatable in other places. Maybe some of the sociological facts that go with it are repeatable. Science doesn't worry about that. Science is worried about the things that are always true everywhere for everybody. And maybe we don't find them. Maybe everything we find in science, we know it's 90% true for 90% of the people in 90% of the places, and the other 10% is not false, we just don't know yet. And we believe and we hope that it'll turn out to be true there too, but that's part of the puzzles we go about solving. Intersubjective testing, testing by one another, things that are true in more than one place and in more than one time. Another attitude science has is we can look for causes and results. We can look for events that are hooked up to one another in a pattern, and we're looking for that as best we can. There may be random mixing, but the random mixing will be around center points or lines or shapes that do have a definite structure. We expect that one event causes another, that nothing lets go or happens out of nowhere. This is the philosophical meaning of all those conservation laws. The conservation of mass and energy means, hey, some can't just disappear. Everything that exists causes other things. Hey, something can't just appear out of nowhere. That would violate the conservation. It would also mean something happened that had no cause. The conservation laws also carry with them the idea that all events are connected, and that there are causal connections between events, and that we can figure out what those connections are using mostly logic and mathematics, occasionally imagination. When we're puzzle solving, we use a lot of math. When we're trying to invent a new theory to suit a bunch of anomalies in a time of revolution, that's when we start using imagination. And imagination is important in science, but once you've got the imaginative thing that you've made up, you've got to go back to logic and math to try to nail it down and show that it really does work. The other attitude is the priority of the real. The priority of what actually is the case in the world. And this priority is important because modern science got started in the 15 and 1600s at a time when philosophy was based upon Aristotle's formulation of the way the world was back with the Greeks 1,500 years before that. And the Greeks thought, hey, thought, thinking, reason, that's the real thing, the root of the universe. So if I think things through, that's what the world has got to be like. And previous to Galileo and the other people that followed him, if you had something you saw in the world that didn't fit an Aristotelian theory, then obviously you saw it wrong. Obviously, you were suffering from an illusion. It was a trick. Because the world had to be according to logic and reason, at least the kind of logic and reason that Aristotle and Plato and their successors taught. But scientists quickly learned in the 16 and 1700s, no, You have to give priority to what actually happened. You have to give priority to what's real. And even if you can't think of any theory to describe it, even if you can't think of any math to use on it, it's still the case that the way the world actually behaves comes first. And we got to build our theories to describe that. Not try to build the world to fit our theories. Science depends upon the ability to change your mind. The ability to change your mind. Mind you, you also have to learn how to hold on. You learn a theory, you learn it well, you learn to apply it to everything, you hold on to it as strong as you can until you can't hold on anymore. Because the world itself forces you to change your mind by behaving differently. This is an attitude that I sum up as the world is what it is. It's actually a line out of a science fiction novel, but most science fiction writers studied a lot of science, and they're trying to reflect scientific attitudes. And when it comes to giving an emotional, attitudinal description of what science is about, sometimes science fiction writers do it better than scientists do, because scientists didn't study how to write affecting prose. They studied how to solve problems and describe them mathematically. The world is what it is. It's not what you wish it was. It's not what your grandfather's theory says it is. It's not even what you think it is. It is what it is. It is what it is, and you're going to have to change the way you think to fit the way the world is, because the world is not going to change to fit the way that you think. This is the most basic, rock-bottom attitude that makes the sciences what they are. And I learned it early because all while I was growing up, I thought for sure I was going to be a mathematical physicist. And I learned it in another way, behaviorally, from my father. Because this was my father's attitude. The world is what it is. No wishful thinking. No kidding yourself. No kidding yourself. That was what he was most worried about. That people were kidding themselves about what was real and what wasn't. Especially the possibility that his sons were. The world is what it is. Now, I grew up in a home that didn't go to church. My father was a scientific agnostic, not an outright atheist, just a scientific agnostic. He'd been born and raised in a Catholic family and not bought into it. So I didn't become a Christian until I was at college, under the impact of a college fellowship. So when I became a Christian, I started reading the Bible. My father was not happy. Does someone have a Bible handy? If you would look up Exodus 3, 1 through 6, and 13 through 15. I'm going to want it read out loud in just a minute. My father was not happy. Christianity to him counted as one of those things that people kid themselves about. One of those comfortable, friendly, warm lies people tell themselves to cope with a difficult and messy world. But my father also believed that freedom and independence were really important, even if the people in question were your sons. So the summer I came home and told him I became a Christian, he was grumpy, he was silent about it, and he went out and he bought the biggest Bible he could find. It was a big translation called the Jerusalem Bible, which was full of notes and introductions and explanations. He walked in and he plumped it down in front of me on the table and he said, "Well, if you're going to do this, then you better do it right, so I expect you to read that thing." Mind you, he didn't believe in it, not in the least. But whatever you were going to believe, he expected you to do it responsibly, seriously, trying to find the truth, operating as though the world is what it is. Okay? So I'm reading it. I started reading at the beginning. Not necessarily a good place to start if you're a brand new Christian. There ought to be a certain amount of jumping around. Maybe you should begin with one of the Gospels, and then back up and catch the Old Testament, and then go back to the Gospels or Acts and some of the letters, and then go back and catch the prophets or something. It would be interesting to find someone who's a brand new Christian who'd never read any of the Bible and try to figure out the best order for them to read it in. So here I am reading it, and I came to Exodus 3. So, who's got what translation that could read this for us? NRSV?
Yeah.
That's good enough. Read these verses out loud for us.
Great. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight, and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations.
Amen. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I'm reading along, and I come to this passage. And there are notes that tell me that this name that God gives himself is a hard thing to understand in Hebrew, and could be translated different ways. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And we usually translate the short form of that we use in the rest of the Bible as the Lord as I am. Although probably a better translation would be I who am. Me, the real one, the actual God, I who am, has sent you to the Israelites to lead them out. Now, names were an important thing in the religions of the old world. It's not for nothing that Moses is asking, well, what is your name? What shall I tell them your name is? Because the name of a God was what gave you a grip on that God. You couldn't force the God to your will. Maybe you could trick him sometimes or bribe him. That's what sacrifices were sometimes about. But that was what allowed you to connect with the God. If you had a name, you had a grip on that God, and you could claim certain small privileges. You could claim a certain connection. So Moses asked for the name. How can we connect with you? How can we get a grip on you? What's our clunk, our chunk, our ability to grab you when we need you? And God says, this is my name. You don't have to grab a hold of me. I am who I am. You don't get to pull me in when you like to, when you want to, because there's something you want, because you sacrificed or tried to bribe me. I will be who I will be. I'm not your God. You are my people. Now that you know that, yes, I'm your God too, but your God is the God who will be who he will be. So say to the Israelites, I who am has sent you. When I read that, it was like a bell started ringing. Not just in my head, but with the vibration shaking up the whole world. Because everything I'd always thought and understood about what I thought I was going to do in the world, be a mathematical physicist, all the attitudes towards science I had, and when I was young, from the age I was 10 until about the time I was 30, I used to read 300 or 400 books a year, and half of them nonfiction. And of that half, 70 to 80% science and math. This bell started ringing, and it said, hey, there isn't going to be any conflict here. There isn't going to be any conflict here. Because the God who grabbed a hold of your life in Jesus Christ is the God who created the world. And if your God created the world, then the world ought to be the kind of place that that God would create so that you could come to know Him there. So you shouldn't be surprised if that bell starts ringing and there are reverberations of who God is in the world. Now mind you, that doesn't mean that you could go study the world and you figure out who God is all by yourself just from the study of quantum physics. You can't. Quantum physics lies there kind of neutral. If you know God, then you can see the echoes in quantum physics. But if you don't know God, all you'll see in quantum physics is some very interesting mathematics and some very weird ways that the world behaves. But there was this bell ringing. I didn't expect to find any conflicts. I didn't expect to find that I couldn't put these two things, what I knew about the world from the sciences and what I was understanding about faith in God through the church I was part of and through reading the Bible and through the Holy Spirit working in my heart to change me now that I profess loyalty to Jesus Christ. I didn't expect to find any conflicts there. But the history of our times is full of the idea that there's a conflict, a battle between science and faith. I mean, we've got that famous story of Galileo, who looked in the heavens with his telescope and said, hey, everything doesn't move around the earth. Those four things move around Jupiter. And the earth moves. And the sun isn't a perfect, featureless sphere of light. It's got spots on it. And the moon has craters and chunks, and it looks like someone's been beating it up. It's not this perfect thing out beyond the surface of the earth, where here on earth everything is broken and messy, but up in the heavens everything is pure. And the Pope said, don't you dare teach people that. It'll contradict their faith and they'll quit believing in God. And brought Galileo up before, well, not before the Inquisition, they didn't send him to that, but before a council of learned theologians to advise him about how best to explain himself so that no one would cease to believe the gospel because of him. And so Galileo had to back off. This is the picture we've heard, the story that's been told 1,000 times now. And it goes on from there about how science and religion were beating one another up all through the years from the 1500s through now. That story is actually mostly an invention. That story was mostly invented in the 1800s. That story mostly wasn't invented. The story about Galileo is true, but using that story about Galileo to characterize the whole relationship of science and faith, that's the story part. That wasn't invented until the church started getting mad and arguing with science over the theory of evolution and over the source of human beings. Before that, all through the 16 and 1700s and the first half of the 1800s, a lot of scientists believed in God, and some of them were serious Christians and saw no necessary conflict. In fact, some historians have said, look, science, the way we know it, got started in Western Europe precisely because Western Europe was a Christian country where people believed that God created the world not by magic, not out of some pre-existing goop, but by His Word, which means logic and reason. That Christians believed that the world made sense, that God created it with sense in it, that God created it to be known and understood by us because it was given to us in the Garden of Eden, and we were built for it to be its caretakers and its guardians. This attitude helped get the sciences started. It was Christians who know that God is who He is. And if I'm in conflict with God, it's because I've fallen away. If I'm in conflict with God, it's because I've sinned, or gone astray, or I'm afraid, or I'm hiding from God. And God's not going to change just because I've changed. And the only way I'm going to find out who God is to change back again. And the hard part is that I can't do it by myself, and that's what Jesus Christ is all about. But this underlying attitude that we have to respond to God, because God is who He is, that attitude leaked into the sciences. Some historians describe it that way. I think it is certainly at least 2/3 accurate that that underlying attitude was part of the birth of modern science. So what we know as the battle between science and theology sort of got partially started in the 1700s with the Enlightenment. Some of the Enlightenment philosophers believed that Christianity was a wicked superstition that screwed people up. This was Voltaire in France. Other figures in the Enlightenment, like Immanuel Kant, believed in God and believed sort of in Christianity, that it describes some true things about how we related to God, but a philosophical description of that was purer and cleaner and better. Christianity was untrue as this superstitious religion, but true as a philosophical description of who God was and what the world was, even if the idea of Jesus Christ and repentance was a little iffy. So it got started in the 1700s, but it was still mixed then. There were still people who believed in God. Even David Hume, who was a great skeptic, went to church and was pretty sure he believed in God, even though he was skeptical of it, and was pretty sure there was some true stuff in Christianity, even though he was also sure there was a lot of junk in it. The idea that there was a total battle between science and Christian faith didn't come up until the 1800s, when the fight over evolution started. So you've got this thing here, this relationship between science and faith. And I've got this attitude that I get from a combination of how I grew up in the sciences and under my father, and what I bumped into when I first became a Christian. So the question arises, okay, what is the relationship between science and Christian faith? Because our faith is not just this little private thing about our relationship personally to God, or even about our relationship to the church and the church's relationship to God. Our faith is supposedly about the whole universe throughout all of time and space. That's why it starts with God creating everything. That's why it ends with the whole universe being remade, cleaned up, and ready for redeemed people. So there's no way of hiding from the necessity of finding some sort of relationship between them. There are a variety of ways of dealing with the relationship. I've put them on a scale from all the way to the extreme science side, all the way to the other extreme that we find sometimes in some versions of faith. The first one is, all religion is bullshit. And there are people who think that, even now. There are some scientists who take the attitude that, look, science is the only way we have of finding out things that are true, that aren't colored by people's prejudices or their mistakes, because we test it back and forth. Science discovers things that are true, and nothing else is. This second statement is actually a faith statement by scientists. Nothing else is true than science. That's a faith statement. You can't prove it scientifically. That's the far left view of some kinds of scientists, and even more of philosophers of science. Philosophers of science want to believe that science is the stuff that really tells us what life means and what the world is all about. So that's an attitude on that side of the scale. Religion is all bullshit. Now, in our day and age, the problem that people have with religion might not be as much that religion is false, the way that the argument has gone for the last 400 years. Nowadays, the argument is not so much that religion is false as that religion is wicked. The people who believe in religion bomb buildings. The people who believe in religion bomb abortion clinics. The people who believe in religion are so sure they're right, they're willing to demonize other people. They're willing to say, no, that's wrong, that's bad, these people are wicked and miserable, and we shouldn't let people of the same sexes get married. That's what religious people are like, they say. I'm sure you've seen this stuff, how God spoils everything, or maybe it's how religion spoils everything. There are a dozen, maybe 24 books in the last 20 years seeking to explain what's wrong with religion, not because it's not true, but because it makes people behave badly. So maybe most of the argument I'm dealing with this morning is from the past. But it's from a long past. And I'm worrying about the issue of truth. The other argument would need a whole nother lecture at another time. And that's all right. You can't do everything all at the one time. You can't preach every part of the gospel all in one sermon. So you shouldn't try, but you should leave markers that say, okay, I can't deal with this at this time, but I've marked it as something to look at later. I'm not ignoring it. I'm not skipping it. I'm just marking it for dealing with later, because you can't do everything at once. Another attitude is, okay, religion's not wicked. It's not totally, completely false. It's something people made up because it's useful for making identity. We're all the Mormons. Our ancestors came into Utah because they were being murdered in Illinois and Missouri. You know, it's our identity. The Jews always had this powerful identity based upon their kosher laws about how they could eat. This meant that they couldn't eat with other people. And their laws about not working on the Sabbath and things like that, that separated them out, so they ended up living in ghettos. So religion is something that helps people find and make an identity for themselves. Or perhaps religion conserves and teaches these ethical values. These ethical values. What difference does it make that Jesus died for our sins? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That stands all by itself, doesn't it? That's true even if Jesus never existed, doesn't it? So the attitude is, hey, religion's probably not true, but it does carry some important values. It carries some human identity. It carries some ethics. Or more in the middle, that religion and science are compatible. They're both about the same world, this one that we live in. And we might not be able to figure out how they fit together now, but they do fit together somehow. And bit by bit, we can figure it out. And if nothing else, after we're dead, in the resurrection, we'll be able to see and understand how they did fit together, even if we didn't figure it out in this life. That's a kind of a middle position, and I myself take that. Not every Christian theologian does. But some of us do. And you need to know where I'm coming from, so you can doubt me or question me, or figure it out differently for yourself if that's what you need to do. Or, going towards the more conservative religious side, you can have the attitude that, okay, science is right about electrons and steel and frogs, but it doesn't have any idea at all what it means to be a human being, to have a soul, what it means, what stuff counts spiritually, what stuff really makes a difference. It can't see that God created the world, it just sees this light in the sky that it can resolve with telescopes and says, hey, those are galaxies, they're billions of light years away. Yeah, science knows some true stuff about the things that don't really matter. It's our faith that tells us about everything that does really matter. Or even, and this is the far, far right hand, science is bullshit. Science was made up by people who had rejected God, and it's been manipulated by evil spirits, and it sounds convincing only for the purpose of distracting us from Jesus Christ. It sounds true only for the purpose of getting us to doubt God. There are some Christian theologians who sometimes talk like that. They're relatively rare these days. They were more common 100 years ago. But they're not all gone. There's a whole range of different attitudes. And I take one that's somewhere in the middle. But it's somewhere in the middle and it's got some virtues so that it doesn't lie flat in the middle. It sort of rises up in the middle. At least I hope it does. You'll have to decide for yourself whether it does or not. God is kind of invisible to science. If science is looking for the things that don't change, that stay the same, no matter what else happens, about the world, about the natural world. Do you know what the word nature means? Where it comes from? Nature means the inner being of something. The nature of the thing is what it must be, what it can't help but be. The natural world is the world looked at as the way it has to behave. It must conserve matter and energy. It must conserve angular momentum. It must exchange photons and electrons according to the rules of quantum electrodynamics. It must combine atoms into molecules according to valences and quantum descriptions of electron shells. This is its nature. This is what it must be. Nature is the way things must be according to their inner essence. That's what science studies. God is who He is, not who He must be. God decides for Himself who God is. God decides for Himself who God is so powerfully that God isn't even trapped by His own omnipotence. The Muslims believe that God is great, the creator of all things, is above all things, is omnipotent, completely, totally, utterly powerful. And for that reason, they believe that God could not have become a human being in Jesus Christ. And that Christians are committing the ultimate blasphemy. Because God could not become that, because God is so omnipotent. Christians believe that God is not trapped even by His own omnipotence. God can decide for Himself to become less than He is in order to become human, in order that we can become more than we are. Science doesn't deal with the stuff that can be anything it wants to be. Science doesn't deal with the stuff that arises from free choice. Science deals with the stuff that behaves the way it has to behave according to its own inner essence or laws, the laws of physics or whatever you may have. And so, God is invisible to science. But science is not invisible to us. Because God did make some things to be what they are. Made the world, made the logic and the sense of the world, had reasons and intentions, created the world with a word, not by manipulating this chaotic pre-existent mud. Now, because science is not invisible to us in the faith, I think it's useful and valuable for us to come to some understanding of what the relationship is between science and Christian faith. Not because we can prove God scientifically, we can't. Science is about things that must be what they are. But I got to ask, and we got to think about, if we're going to talk about some compatibility between science and religion, maybe they have overlapping spheres. We, human beings, are partly able to choose who we are and what we'll be. And we're partly not able to. We did inherit a certain genetic structure. We did inherit certain built-in programming in our brains. On top of that genetic structure and that built-in programming, we do have a certain real freedom that science probably can't capture. But we also have a lot of determined being that science can't capture. So if there's compatibility, it's overlapping. It might overlap a lot, but it doesn't overlap perfectly. And the question is, why would we want to? Why am I doing this? I got some verses here. These are verses I use to formulate my attitude about how I'm going to form an understanding of compatibility between science and faith. One of them is, judge not, lest you be judged. That is, we shouldn't judge. The science is saying, no, this is false, it's trying to distract us from God. Because we know that we've tried to distract ourselves from God. We've sinned, we've hidden from God, we've refused to acknowledge God from time to time. No matter how good Christians we are, we probably really only believe in God seriously 25% of the time. And 50% of the time we believe in God sort of, kind of over there. And 25% of the time we're probably busy being wicked and refusing to admit that God is God and refusing to behave like we ought to behave. So let's not judge, because we're guilty too. It also says, in Matthew 7:12, it says, treat others the way you would want them to treat you. Well, if we would like the sciences to admit that our faith could be true, then Jesus tells us that the way to do that is to start by treating them as though they might be true too. And to try to understand them even though they're misunderstanding God. We should even do that with sinners who are denying that is a God. So of course we should use it with the sciences that aren't necessarily trying to demonstrate that there is no God. They're just trying to demonstrate that the world might have started 13.7 billion years ago. When we're trying to construct an understanding between our faith and what's in the sciences, we use the golden rule. We treat the sciences the way that we wish they would treat us, even if they don't. Even if they don't. Because it also says in Matthew, Peter says, hey, if someone sins against me, how often shall I forgive them? 7 times? And Jesus says, no, I tell you 7 times 77. Or maybe he says just 77 times. Meaning a lot, meaning over and over again. Meaning even if the sciences come out and slap you in the face and say, you're wrong, you don't know the truth, it's still our job to turn the other cheek and use the golden rule and try to understand. It's to our advantage. Paul in Philippians says, hey, if there's anything that's true, if there's anything that's good, if there's anything that's right or beautiful, pay attention to it. Pay attention to it. Truth comes from God. Rightness comes from God. If there's an essence to things that can be discovered by scientific research, it comes from God, even if we study it with science. So whatever is true, right, and good, whatever is beautiful, pay attention to that. These are the rules I use to try to figure out and understand what the relationship is between what the sciences are teaching me about the world and what the sciences are as a practice and what my faith is. And the question is, why? Why bother? Why work on such an understanding? Why can't we just say, hey, it's okay. Science informs engineering, and engineering builds us cars and houses and bridges and stuff like that, and that's good enough. And I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to try to build some sort of correspondence. God tells me what my life is all about, and I'm going to work with that. And the why is this. We have, in the church, a really dangerous tendency to act as though we lived in two worlds. We live in this world, here and now, and we live partly and will live eventually in another world, a heaven, after we're dead, after the resurrection, after the end of all things, somewhere else, somewhere up above, somewhere beyond. And when we have that attitude, we frequently act as though, and in this world, God is just something we believe. And we believe that God is active in this world, but the fact of the matter is that we don't behave like it. We say we trust God, but we act like we trust money, a good education, a good job, a good hospital, the hope of a long life, and a government that can protect us from the bad guys. And we act like we trust God for after we're dead, so that we won't die forever. But in this life, we got other things that we trust more. That's how we actually act, no matter what we say about what we believe. We act like this world is just a preliminary place, a sort of a testing place, and the real world comes afterwards, or is up above, or beyond. That's an attitude that the Hebrews, that the Israelites, that the prophets would have found silly. God is the God of this world. This world is the world that God made. And it may be set in the midst of a bigger, more spiritual world, but it's set in the midst of it, and this is the one that was made for us. This is the world we live in. This is the world where we met God. We didn't meet God in that other world up above in heaven. We didn't meet God in that other world after we're dead, beyond the end of this life. We met God here, because this is where God came to us. This is where God became human. This is the world that God meant for us and meant us for. And God pronounced it good back before we sinned, meaning that it was going to work. We were going to learn things about who we were and who God was in this world. That there would be things about the way the world was built that God would be able to use to build up a stronger, a richer, a more intricate and complex and fun relationship with us. So that we would love Him more and more, and His love for us would become more and more to us. It's this world. And we forget it. And we neglect it. And we act as though we can live in this world according to this world's rules and count on God for later. And count on God for something more. But we start by living this world by this world's rules. That even goes for things like economics. Andrew Carnegie was a Presbyterian elder. John D. Rockefeller was a Baptist deacon. And they acted like Christians at the end of their lives when they started giving their money away in huge amounts. But they didn't act like Christians when they made their money. They made their money according to the rules of this world, grabbing it left and right, getting the governor to send out the National Guard to shoot striking steelworkers, making secret deals to pay me from out of the money that other companies pay you to transport their oil. All kinds of wickedness. It goes even economically. We practice it in our own lives. I'll bet you, if you think about it, you can find ways that you act like God is for later or for something special, but not for every day. And that is a big problem. Because this is the world where we have to become like Christ. This is the world where we have to do what God told us. This is the world where we have to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is the world where we have to know God and love God. And eternity, or heaven, is bigger and beyond, but it also includes this world. This world was set in the midst of the heavens. This world was created in the midst of God's power. This world will come to an end and God will make a new world for us, but this world isn't a separate, empty, wrong place. So one of the ways that we try to recognize who we are, and who we're supposed to be, and how we're supposed to live in this world, is partly to try to understand how science and Christian faith fit together, and why they shouldn't conflict, and why we should have an attitude of, hey, I'm going to treat the sciences as they should treat me. I'm going to learn from them as much as I can. And if I can learn something from them that helps me love God better, I'll take it. I'll take it. Because I trust that God built this world to be what it is, so that I would come to know God and love God better. Amen.
Amen.
All right, I'm going to take some questions and answers in a minute, but I'm going to turn the thing off.